We don't talk enough about what happens when the person who always gives finally gets tired. When the person who showed up, checked in, forgave, softened, suddenly stops. Because let me tell you, when the empath is done, it's not with noise, it's with silence. And that silence, that's where the avoidant starts to panic. See, the empath isn't just someone who loves deeply. They feel deeply. They read between the words. They sense the things that aren't being said. They forgive before they even get the apology. And when they fall for someone who leans avoidant, that gift of sensitivity turns into a heavy burden. The avoidant doesn't show up emotionally. They pull away just when connection starts to deepen. They dismiss vulnerability. And for a while, the empath will try harder. They'll over-communicate to compensate for the silence. They'll love harder to fix the cracks. But they can't fix what's not being held by two hands. And one day, after another ignored message, another missed emotional moment, the empath shifts. Not loudly, but inwardly. That moment is not the explosion, it's the withdrawal of energy, of hope, of trying. That's when the danger begins, because now the avoidant realizes something's off, that the person they thought would always wait has moved on emotionally, and now they feel the loss. Not because they've changed, but because their comfort is being threatened, their control is slipping, and the panic sets in. But by then, the empath isn't angry, they're detached. And that is the most powerful and dangerous version of them. Not because they want revenge, but because now they know their worth. And once an empath knows their worth, they never beg for breadcrumbs again. The empath in a relationship is often the emotional anchor. They're the one who listens intently, who senses the shifts in tone, who remembers the little details and holds space for the other person's fears, hesitations, and wounds. At the beginning of a relationship, this can seem like a gift, because it is. The empath gives not just love, but understanding, patience, compassion, and emotional labor. They often take on the role of the fixer, not out of superiority, but from a genuine desire to help things work. When the other person pulls away, the empath leans in. When communication becomes unclear, they clarify. When love feels distant, they love harder. It becomes second nature to compensate for what's lacking, to maintain harmony even when the emotional weight isn't being shared. In relationships with avoidant types, people who fear intimacy or become uncomfortable with emotional closeness, this imbalance becomes even more pronounced. The avoidant may not express affection in consistent ways. They may retreat in moments that require vulnerability. They may downplay the empath's needs, labeling them as too much or too sensitive. But the empath, being wired for emotional connection, often internalizes this. They start questioning themselves. Maybe I am asking for too much. Maybe if I just hold on a little longer, they'll open up. So they try harder. They show up more. They shrink themselves to be more palatable. They stretch themselves thin to make the relationship feel stable. But every empath has a quiet threshold, a moment, invisible even to themselves, where something inside begins to shift. This doesn't usually come from a single dramatic event, but from a slow build-up of unmet needs, unreciprocated efforts, and emotional invalidation. It's the moment they reread a conversation and realize how much they were reaching. It's after the 5th or 6th time they've been dismissed when expressing their feelings. It's waking up one day and feeling tired, not just physically. Their nervous system, once wired for hyper-awareness to the avoidance moods, starts to crave peace over possibility. This shift isn't obvious to the outside world. The empath may still smile, still check in, still offer kindness, but internally they are quietly folding up their energy, wrapping up their hope, and starting to protect what's left of their emotional reserves. Their giving nature doesn't disappear, but it becomes guarded. Not out of spite, but out of necessity, because even the most open-hearted person reaches a point where their love no longer wants to be wasted on someone who doesn't know how to receive it. Avoidant behavior doesn't always show up as outright rejection. Often it arrives subtly through delayed replies, vague statements, emotional aloofness, and a general sense that closeness is met with discomfort. To an empath, this isn't just confusing, it's destabilizing. The person they care about isn't being cruel, but they aren't being available either. It creates an invisible tension where every attempt to connect feels like stepping onto uncertain ground. The empath reaches out emotionally, and what they get back is a wall, or worse, a cold absence disguised as independence. This kind of emotional distance isn't passive. It's felt deeply, and not just in words, but in presence. The avoidant partner might be physically there, but mentally far away. They might change the subject when things get emotional, or make the empath feel guilty for needing reassurance. Over time, this sends a clear message: your emotional needs are inconvenient. Your vulnerability is too much. And this message, though never spoken directly, plants quiet seeds of doubt in the empath's mind. In the early stages, the empath will compensate. They'll try to prove they're not asking for too much. They'll shrink their feelings into more digestible pieces, hoping that by making themselves easier to love, the avoidant will finally meet them halfway. But this becomes a cycle. The more the empath gives, the more the avoidant retreats. Not because the empath is doing something wrong, but because avoidance thrives in low-stakes emotional environment. True intimacy feels threatening to someone who has learned to protect themselves by staying distant. The relationship begins to feel like an emotional chase. The empath offers softness, and the avoidant responds with withdrawal. The empath seeks depth, while the avoidant clings to surface-level safety. Eventually, the empath starts to feel emotionally starved. They're pouring energy into a space that never feels filled. Their attempts at connection are met with deflection. Their emotional investment becomes one-sided, and nothing is more exhausting than trying to love someone who sees closeness as a threat. This slow erosion doesn't happen overnight. It's the repeated letdowns, the missed emotional opportunities, the inability of the avoidant to step up when it counts. It's watching the person you care about pull away every time you open your heart, and realizing that your safety net in the relationship only exists if you stop needing anything. That's when the connection starts to decay, not in anger, but in silent depletion. The empath begins to feel alone, even in the presence of the person they once trusted most. The moment an empath detaches isn't marked by shouting accusations or dramatic ultimatums. It's quiet. It arrives like a tide pulling back, barely noticeable at first, but irreversible once it starts. This kind of emotional detachment is not about punishment. It's about preservation. For the empath, it comes after countless moments of trying to communicate, to connect, to understand someone who remains emotionally closed. After investing so much energy into the relationship, they find themselves depleted, no longer motivated by hope, but by the need to protect their peace. Detachment doesn't look like anger. It looks like no longer explaining themselves, no longer trying to decode silence or justify their own feelings. Where they once overthought every message, every pause, every reaction, they now stop caring about the response. Their emotional focus, once aimed entirely at the other person, begins to turn inward. They stop seeking answers from someone who has consistently avoided giving them. And in that shift, something powerful happens. They regain control over their emotional landscape. This moment can be deeply unsettling for the avoidant partner. They're used to the empath showing up no matter what. Used to the reassurance, the forgiveness, the emotional availability being handed to them freely. But now, the dynamic has changed. The empath doesn't chase. They don't ask what's wrong anymore. They no longer fill the silence. And that silence becomes the loudest message of all. To the avoidant, this detachment can feel like loss, even if they never admitted they feared losing the empath. But they don't understand that this isn't just space being given, it's space being claimed. The empath is no longer waiting for the other person to step up. They're not waiting at all. They've stepped back, not to provoke a reaction, but because they finally see the truth of the relationship, that they were doing all the emotional lifting and it wasn't being met. This shift is what makes detachment so powerful and dangerous in a quiet, unshakable way. The empath isn't seeking revenge or trying to make the avoidant jealous. They're just done. Not because they stopped loving, but because they started listening to themselves. And once that emotional door begins to close, it rarely reopens. Not out of coldness, but clarity. The empath has finally chosen themselves, not in anger, but in alignment. And in that stillness, they find a strength they didn't even know they had. When the empath finally pulls away, the avoidant often experiences a reaction that catches even them off guard. Panic, not the kind that comes from losing someone they deeply nurtured or prioritized, but from the sudden disruption of their comfort zone. The empath, after all, provided a kind of emotional safety net, always being there, always understanding, always absorbing the tension and filling in the emotional blanks. When that energy disappears, the avoidant loses the person who allowed them to feel close without ever demanding true vulnerability. And the moment that disappears, it threatens their sense of emotional control. Avoidants typically operate on emotional distance. They prefer to keep things undefined, casual, or safely walled off. Intimacy, real intimacy, requires them to confront feelings they've been trained to suppress or avoid. So when the empath begins to step back, the avoidant feels something they rarely allow themselves to feel: emotional instability. Not because they suddenly recognize the value of the relationship in a deep, reflective way, but because they realize their emotional buffer is gone. The empath had always been the one to reach out after conflict, the one to hold space during silence, the one to calm the emotional tension without needing reassurance in return. But now the silence feels different. It's no longer a waiting room for the empath's forgiveness, it's a closing door. And this lack of response doesn't invite peace for the avoidant, it creates anxiety. Suddenly their control over the rhythm of the relationship, when to connect, when to withdraw, starts to dissolve. What looks like panic to others might show up as a surge of contact, unexpected texts, sudden interest, attempts to re-engage, or even love bomb. But these efforts often come from fear, not growth. The avoidant isn't necessarily trying to build a healthier connection. They're trying to pull the empath back into the dynamic where they felt most in control. They miss the emotional labor being done for them, not the person doing it. This panic is a reaction to loss of control, not an awakening of love. And while it may be disguised as longing or realization, it often lacks the depth required for true emotional change. Because if they had truly seen the empath's value, they wouldn't have waited until their absence to recognize it. The empath didn't walk away lightly. They gave chances, had conversations, showed patience. But once their emotional energy is reclaimed, they're not swayed by panic-fueled gestures. They're no longer looking for signs of effort. They're looking for consistency. And they know the difference. When an empath finally sees their worth, it changes everything. This is not a moment of inflated ego or a need for validation from others. It's a quiet, internal shift where the empath realizes that their capacity to love deeply is a strength, not a weakness. For so long, they may have mistaken self-sacrifice for love, believing that if they just held on longer, loved harder, or communicated more clearly, the relationship would evolve. But eventually, they reach a point where they stop looking at the other person and start looking at themselves. And what they see is someone who gave everything and received only fragments in return. This awakening is often sparked not by anger, but by clarity. The empath starts to recognize patterns, how they overextended themselves, how their needs were minimized, how their emotional sensitivity was taken for granted. And for the first time, they no longer feel the urge to fix or chase or explain. They no longer mistake withdrawal for mystery or inconsistency for passion. They begin to accept that someone else's inability to show up is not a reflection of their worth, but of the other person's emotional limitations. With that realization comes a new kind of power, one that doesn't seek revenge or retribution, but boundaries. The empath begins to filter what they give and to whom. They're still kind, still emotionally intelligent, but they no longer tolerate confusion masquerading as connection. They stop entertaining situations that require them to abandon themselves just to maintain closeness. What once felt like love now feels like self-betrayal, and they refuse to return to it. To the avoidant partner, this version of the empath is unfamiliar. They're no longer available in the same way. Their silence isn't a game, it's peace. Their distance isn't punishment, it's protection. The avoidant may attempt to rekindle the connection, perhaps with grand gestures or belated admissions of care, but the empath now sees through it. Not because they've become cold, but because they've become clear. They know the difference between words and actions, between effort and pattern, between desire and capacity. Once the empath reclaims their worth, they become someone who no longer bends to be chosen. They choose themselves. And that is where the danger lies. Not in aggression, but in their refusal to settle for emotional crumbs. They now understand that love should not cost them their self-respect. And with that knowing, they walk away not just from the relationship, but from the person they used to be in it. So when the empath is finally done, it's not about drama. It's not about proving a point. It's about reclaiming the energy they gave so freely for so long to someone who couldn't meet them there. What once looked like unconditional love turns into self-protection. And when that happens, when the giver stops giving, when the listener stops explaining, when the heart that used to bend starts to stand tall, that's when the avoidant feels the shift. Not because the empath is punishing them, but because their safety net is gone. And the truth is, most avoidants don't realize what they had until it's no longer waiting in the wings. But the real story here isn't about punishment or revenge. It's about power. The quiet, grounded kind. The kind that comes when someone realizes they never needed to beg for love, because the right kind of love was never going to make them beg in the first place. To anyone who's been the empath, your love was never the problem. Your sensitivity was never a flaw. But your peace, that's priceless. And once you know that, you'll never trade it for temporary connection again. Thank you for listening, for showing up for yourself, and for being willing to hear this message. Whether you're still giving, starting to let go, or fully walking away, know this: choosing yourself is never the wrong decision. Stay soft, but stay strong. Take care of your heart. Thank you, and goodbye.